Hello everyone and welcome back to Quick Flicks, the show on the internet that I review movies on. And this is the first Quick Flicks of 2021. I would have had some in January, but unfortunately, not much really happened in January other than, lots of things in the media. But I was going to put out something at the end of the month last month, which would have been the first episode of the Criterion Review, but that has been pushed to the end of February. And the reason why for that is because of Sundance 2021. Sundance this year is interesting because this is technically the first time I've ever covered films that got out of Sundance. This was my first year I ever attended Sundance, albeit it's virtual because of COVID. But I found myself really liking the energy, even if I was at home. I found ways to enjoy myself while watching these particular movies. I didn't get to watch every single movie this year, mostly because I didn't have the money for it, but I managed to scrounge up some money to watch at least 10 different films at a student discount price. Now, the films I didn't get to watch are films like Coda, which was acquired by Apple recently for like $20 million or something like that. Prisoners of Ghostland, which is a Nicolas Cage starring film. I wanted to watch that, but it continually got, sold out of tickets. There was also a documentary about soul music, and that got plenty of awards, and I really wanted to check that one out too, but there was no screenings either. And one film that was premiering at Sundance was Judas and the Black Messiah, and I had kind of a option to really take. Should I risk, the money to watch this early, or wait until February 12th when it's put on HBO Max for a month? And I eventually decided not to watch it early. So Judas and the Black Messiah's review will have to be pushed to next week. And it probably would have been in this particular video, but, I'd rather, save some money and watch it on HBO, a thing I normally pay for anyway. So there's all that. So in this video, I'm going to rank the films I did see from my least favorite to my favorite. A lot of these films people are not really talking about much, but there are people who do talk about it. So let's take a look at my 10 films I saw at Sundance 2021. Eight for Silver is a werewolf horror movie of sorts that attempts to look at colonialism in a critical eye, and it just doesn't work. Now, during the Q&A of this movie, the director had said that he looked at the origins of the werewolf and how the werewolf was usually put in place to be a caricature or a evil stand-in for Jewish people, which in of itself is, anti-Semitic. However, the problem is that his attempt to try to subvert that, his attempt to, or at least non-attempt, to try to criticize anything of the original context for this is just thrown out the window. The film is about this group of white settlers who are rich and affluent that take over a plot of land from the Romani people, and they basically execute all of them in a genocidal act that is in display of this movie, and they don't really hold back on the brutality of this, and it is an attempt to show how brutalistic colonialists are. The problem is that there's no actual connection between the critique of what it's trying to do and what it eventually does in the third act. And I am going to be talking a little bit of spoilers in this, so if you are slightly interested in this movie, then, go watch that movie if it ever comes out. But to be honest, I don't know if anyone will be wanting to watch this movie after I talk about it. So now that we've set up the fact that the whole plot of this movie revolves around them killing Romani people in this sort of, oh yeah, we're going to kill all these people because we want their land, and it becomes a case throughout the rest of the movie that this curse is on cursed burial grounds from where they killed all these people, which is a common trope that's used a lot in horror movies. In America, for instance, there's a lot of instances of, Indian burial grounds. Like, take a look at Pet Sematary, for instance, or even Poltergeist, stuff like that is like Native American burial ground, mumbo jumbo that's not great. It's just not a good trope to have in horror movies because it exploits like marginalized communities as a way of being the villain to the, Christian white cis male like stuff, right? And it's basically the same thing here in Eight for Silver. The Romani people essentially put a curse on this pair of teeth, I guess, that's made of silver. And once someone is bitten with that thing of silver, they start turning into these creatures, which I will admit the way the werewolf thing is designed, I guess, is somewhat different to other werewolves. But at the same time, it really reminds me of Alien Resurrection, and I just can't have that. But the thing that really, doesn't work about this movie, too, is the way that they go about solving the issue. Now, I have no idea how, they could have solved this issue in the film, but the way that they get rid of the threat, the curse, is basically the same thing that they did to get themselves to this place in the first place, where you have a bunch of people being killed by these werewolf creatures, and the only way apparently to combat these creatures, or at least to try to rectify the situation, is by shooting him in the same nefarious pattern that caused them to get into this trouble in the first place. And it's just repetitive. And they do the whole stupid, silver bullet bullshit. It's like, it tries to do something new with the werewolf formula. And I'm a huge fan of, reinventing and reinterpreting different, horror, icons and being something new, right? The Invisible Man is a pretty cool little reinvention where it focuses on a completely different character, and it makes the struggle about this one specific character, and not just about the maniacal wanderings of a evil scientist, or even like the Wolf of Snow Hollow was a reinvention of the werewolf type, whereas it's not very supernatural, but they put it in more of a serial killer-esque type of situation and make it a dark comedy, and also a critique of toxic masculinity. They tried to do something like that in Eight for Silver, and it just, either they didn't want to engage with the actual subject, or even engage in the, morality tale that's supposedly supposed to be in this. Because this truly, honestly, could have been something like Drag Me to Hell. But it doesn't. All I'm saying is, at the end of the day, Eight for Silver is not really good, and it's not terribly bad. It's just bad, It has some racist undertones, it has some really stupid shit that happens, and it looks fine, but there's other issues I do have with it, such as there's this 10-minute segment where it's nothing but dream sequence, jump scares, dream sequences of jump scares, and it gets repetitive. There's a lot of repetitive natures in this film that really pad out the film, and either they could have shortened these sections or just get rid of them altogether and you would not miss a damn thing about this. And then, of course, one of the bigger things that some people were talking about is the narrative framing at the beginning that has no correlation to the end. Like, the beginning of this movie takes place in World War I, which would be an interesting setting for, a werewolf-type movie. Think World War I, but with werewolves. That would be a really fun, schlocky B-movie horror movie. But that's not where it goes. It sets up this whole thing with, the silver bullets and being the keepers of the silver bullets, but at no point does it ever correlate to anything in the main movie, and by the end of the movie, you're just okay, but why did this happen in the first place? It makes no sense, to be honest. And as of now, Eight for Silver is not my favorite movie of 2021, and definitely is my least favorite of the lineup I saw. The next movie I saw was Prime Time. This is I believe, Polish, hostage film, and I think this one is just kind of fine, to be honest. It's not particularly interesting or engaging all that much, but I do give really good kudos to the direction of this film. Most of it is well contained. It's pretty budget friendly with the amount of locations that are in this film, being that maybe there's 4 or 5 different locations. But the ending had a lot to be desired, and it works for the most part because of the lead actor. He does a really good performance, like holding up this TV station in 1999, yeah, at New Year's Eve. Like his performance is actually pretty fun and engaging, but the ending is just kind of meh. At the Ready is a very interesting documentary to me because it does kind of have some similarities to Homeroom, which is another documentary we'll talk about later. But At the Ready is a film that is well produced. It's a pretty decently produced documentary, and it tells the tale of these kids who go to law enforcement clubs after school. It's part of the school program at this Texas school. And these kids, what makes this interesting is not necessarily the program itself, but the students who go and actively participate in this club. They all come from varying backgrounds, some coming from backgrounds where their parents are, over the border. Some of these kids have issues at home and self-confidence, and they gain self-confidence within this program. And it's a pretty entertaining, if not kind of basic documentary. I'm not saying it's a bad documentary by saying it's basic, but sometimes you need some sort of like basic, documentaries in order to be like, oh, okay, this is fine. I think The Blazing World is one of those movies you'll either love or hate because of the inherent nature of this movie. Even while I was watching this film, the chat was kind of mixed on the whole thing. Some saying it was the best movie that they've seen in the festival, some saying that it wasn't, and it's like the worst thing ever. But The Blazing World is an interesting movie about trauma, about the ways we deal with trauma, but it does it in a very fantastical way. Just think Mirror Mask, but with the same color variations as, say, like the production design of Beetlejuice, or even the dream sequences in Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Like, it has that sort of whimsical quality that has a pretty big, like, metaphoric meaning about, trauma and self-forgiveness. And it's kind of beautiful. But I do need to watch it a couple more times to get my full thoughts on this, because I do think that there's some sort of disconnect that I got from the first act to the third act, and I think, I probably need to rewatch it one more time. If I ever get the opportunity to watch it again, I will. It's pretty interesting, but I do think it's not going to appeal to everyone. Homeroom was a documentary that, again, it's the same thing as At the Ready. It takes place in a high school, but only this time it's not necessarily centered around law enforcement. It's more about the student activists who are trying to talk about law enforcement inside of schools. And my school had a student resource officer, and it talks about the relationship between how the students feel about it and how the parents feel about it, and the struggle between the student government and the local school council to try to come to an agreement about the student resource officers and how the students feel uncomfortable with something like that. And it's a film that takes place between 2019 and 2020, so obviously it's going to have a break because of the whole, COVID-19 thing, but they managed to intermix the stories together to make a cohesive story about these characters. But overall, it's a film that I find pretty standard for the most part. It's well shot, it's well produced, it's edited pretty well, and I think it actually got an audience award, for editing. Some award for editing at Sundance, but in total, I think Homeroom is pretty watchable. It's not perfect, it's not going to win, like best documentary at the Oscars, but it's a pretty watchable documentary, and I think people might enjoy it. Now, Strawberry Mansion is a different kind of film. It's in the same category as The Blazing World, but it's much more straightforward about what it's trying to discuss. So, picture this. You have the technology of Inception, where you can go inside of people's dreams. Now mass produce it and allow people to rewatch the dreams that they have. Only in this universe, the dreams that you have ads in them, and you get taxed for everything that you have in your dreams. It's a pretty interesting concept that's pr- pretty well done for the most part. And I really enjoyed this film's like mise en scène. I like its production design. It's a interesting story for the most part. It follows this tax auditor who has to go to an old lady's house who hasn't paid her taxes in 7 years, but he finds that there's like this secret that's going on inside of her dreams and what she has to offer in terms of the what the nature of dreams are and how people can share dreams. I'm not going to discuss it too much further because this is a really interesting film that not everyone's going to, really enjoy, much like with The Blazing World. But I think Strawberry Mansion is one of those films that is going to get really popular in the indie scene, and I appreciate it for that. I don't think it needs a large audience, but it is a film that I think wholeheartedly might be a really fun watch every once in a while. So, yeah, there's my brief thoughts on that. Street Gang was a documentary I also saw, and it's a documentary about Sesame Street. It's pretty basic in terms of the structure of the film, and it's based around the book of the same name, Street Gang, how we got to Sesame Street. And it only covers about the first 20, 30 years of the production of Sesame Street, all the way up through the deaths of Jim Henson and the guy who plays Mr. Hooper. And it just kind of encapsulates the story of the early founders of Sesame Street, what they were trying to go for in terms of educational television. And they're in kind of the same boat as someone like Mr. Rogers, only in this case, one thing I didn't really know about Sesame Street was the fact that they targeted low-income communities and people into projects and inner cities, such as black kids, because they were the ones who aren't being helped the most in terms of education. So it was up to public television to really try to educate people who didn't have the resources necessary to be educated, such as, numbers and ABCs. And that's something that I actually really enjoy about this movie. There's so many things I didn't really know, and now I'm more interested to read the book that it's based off of. And this documentary has so much archival footage. The amount of footage that they had to go through is amazing. And I'm glad that they actually had an archive for all of this, because I would not know how to go through all of this footage. Now, the film itself is going to be released on home media in the summer, according to the filmmakers, and it's going to be on HBO Max by the end of the year. So take a look at this documentary if you're interested in Sesame Street or the Muppets or anything really. I really enjoyed this documentary, and I would highly suggest it to pretty much anyone. It's for anyone. The first movie I saw at the festival, and I was blown away by this movie. And it's a movie, again, much like with my other films that I like on this list, it's not going to be for everyone. But it's a film that I personally like because I'm a huge film buff. But it also is a film that has layers to it. It takes place in the 80s in the UK during the hysteria of the cinema nasties, right? And what these people would do, the main character is a censor, and they would go through the movie and deem what is and what isn't, passable through the slips of the media stream of the time. And we follow this censor who is pretty objective about her own reality. It isn't until Enid, the main character of the film, discovers a film that reminds her of an incident that she had in her childhood trauma, where her missing sister is. And from there, it becomes a never-ending spiral down through insanity. Censor is a movie that deals with a lot of interesting concepts, such as what our minds edit out due to trauma. Is it morally right in the artistic sense to censor people's projects for the sake of the public good? And while it doesn't necessarily touch hugely on that last point, it is a film that is very interesting, that's very psychological, and an ending that's kind of breaking. And I really enjoyed it. It's not a perfect film by any means, and it's definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But Censor is one of those, like, you know, horror films that I kind of enjoyed. My second to last film I saw at Sundance was The Sparks Brothers, and this comes to us from Edgar Wright, and I believe this is his first documentary. The thing with band documentaries is that a lot of them are kind of the same. It covers their whole history from start to finish, and a lot of them are like, oh, well, we had a falling out, we had this, we had that, and a lot of them have the same sort of presentation, you know, everything just kind of molds together. But Edgar Wright is, I believe, the perfect guy to make a documentary about Sparks, which is a band that has been going on for 50 years. The way Edgar Wright tells stories visually is really complementary to the goofy, outlandish, perfectly, you know, content nature of the band that he's covering. And the art style and the editing and the way the film is pieced together really fits into what Sparks is pretty free and is very proud of what it is. And what this film also surprised me with is the history of Sparks, the two brothers who managed this band. And apparently they never had a falling out. You know, they never did. And even if they didn't win big awards or accolades, they still managed to keep making music even up to this day. They had an album released last year, and apparently I didn't even know about it. And it's interesting to talk about. And it also raises the question of, at one point, comedy in music and how the music industry doesn't like comedy in music, and they have to make, you know, they have this standard of what music is supposed to be, as opposed to, you know, making something comedic. And that's kind of funny, to be honest. And I do think this film is definitely worthy of being on my best list for 2021, and it's probably one of my favorite Edgar Wright films. It's definitely not, you know, going to be everyone's favorite Edgar Wright film, but to be honest, his first attempt at documentary filmmaking is actually pretty well done. Now, I'm not going to talk about too much about details about this one because I want to leave it as spoiler-free as possible. Because when you first hear of, you know, the summary, it's like, oh, it's a story about, you know, this girl who flees Nazi Germany in the search of her parents. It starts off pretty innocently, but it isn't until the layers are you know, pulled back in this story that more and more of the story changes. And I don't want to, like, give away anything, but let me just tell you, this story is not what you think it is. And they even go as far as to do something, you know, with the main person's story that is very interesting. And let me make this clear. This is a documentary. This isn't like a biopic or anything. This is a documentary. And it's well done. The deceptions that this film does in terms of peeling back the story, like, as the film goes on, is continuously surprising. And I never knew about any of this Misha and the Wolves situation. I never knew about it. And it's a film that is going to stand for me in terms of the best of the year, because it is a film that shows how one can co-op something as big as what, you know, it's supposedly supposed to be part of, and make people doubt the legitimacy of said thing. So it is interesting, and I wish I could talk further on this movie, but the film's not released, and I want to talk about it eventually. I will probably talk about it in my best of 2021 list, but suffice to say, this movie is actually one of my favorites of the festival, and is my favorite film of Sundance 2021. And so, those are the movies I saw at Sundance 2021. I am so grateful to Sundance for giving out the opportunity for people in low-income communities and pretty much everywhere around the world the opportunity to tune in and watch these movies from home because, you know, of the pandemic. But it also gives people like me who have no ability to really travel to Sundance or the ability to buy expensive plane tickets or whatnot, the opportunity to watch these films and to connect with filmmakers and even people my age to, you know, get together and start making stuff. And it's a good opportunity that I wish is a thing that they continue to do in the for years to come. It's a great way for networking, and you know what? That's my thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video, which is probably next Friday. See you then. Peace.